All right, part two, French Revolution and reign of Napoleon. I don't know. I don't speak French. Napoleon. Anyway, what's going on with that? So, in this, uh, let's talk about the French Revolution. So, why did it happen? A lot of reasons, but one of which is the serious fiscal problems that France found itself in. By the 1780s, they had huge war debts, not only from the Seven Years' War, not only from trying to keep their colonial empire growing, but also because they're going to help a little 13 colonies that become the United States fight Britain. And so what happens is a huge amount of their tax revenues have to go to these war debts. And so it gets so much that they're going to have to raise taxes. Now, this trying to pay off that about that tax is going to lead to a really revolution in many ways, which is much more radical than the American, and that's because it's going to be getting rid of a whole regime, a whole way that France itself. It's not, hey, people who are halfway around the world and the British Empire gets to go on. This is destroying and trying to rebuild one of the most powerful countries in Europe. So, what is this? What is this ancient regime that they're so upset about? Is the Estates General. So in 1303, the Estates General was founded, and the idea is if the king wanted to do anything really drastic, he would have to call the three estates together, and they would vote, one vote per estate, on whether or not the king can do what he wants. So the first estate made up of the Roman Catholic clergy, about 100,000 people. The second estate is nobles, about 400,000. And then the third estate was everybody else. So that was like 24 million people. So a monstrous number are in on this. And this includes like the poorest of the poor, the serfs, free peasants, so on and so forth. But this also includes rich people who just don't have the noble title. This is the people who make the cities run. This is the business people who are making lots of money. This is the lawyers. This is the educated people. And so all of them were all lumped in together. So one thing I need to do is we normally do a horrible job of we see that the 24 million is bigger, but we have a hard time really picturing that in our head. So people think, okay, so we have 100,000 clergy, we have 400,000 nobles, and then everybody else. So 24 million, it's probably like this. No, 24 million doesn't look like this. 24 million looks like this. All right, so what you can see is we have this really small group of people who are living off of and taking advantage of this great, huge number of people below them. And another thing that's a part of this is just the wealth discrepancy. Okay, so it's been really fashionable in the past couple of years to really talk about wealth distribution in France and the United States, because when you look at what the wealth distribution was before the French Revolution, where things were so dire, they created this huge, bloody revolution to reconfigure society. This is what their wealth distribution looked like. And although it is hard for us to really notice this, because our standard of living in general is better than those who lived back then, the wealth distribution in the United States is in many ways worse than what it was before this huge bloody French Revolution. And the pandemic, don't worry, this is from 2016. So with the pandemic, especially this past year, it is even greater than that. Now, take a breath. Take a breath here. Again, it's normal to start to talk about this because we're like, hey, this could be a problem. But I don't think bloody revolution is right around the corner. We do need to we probably should be looking into how we should change our system to make it more equitable, so small groups aren't completely taking advantage of others. But I don't think that we're sitting on the edge of a class revolution. So what happens here in France? Anyway, so King Louis realizes, hey, I need to raise a lot more taxes. So in May 1789, he calls together the Estate General. So as the first, second, and third estates show up, the third estate is flanked by literal lawyers who say, yeah, okay, we can talk about taxes, but we must have much greater social change to kind of change some of these hills. In June, literally what happens is they argue. In the midst of one of these arguments, they say, okay, look, let's just go home. We'll reconvene and we'll talk about it tomorrow. The third estate representatives show up and they literally lock the door. They lock the door on them and they say, okay, you're going to be like that, right? So they go and they march to a sports complex, which where they create the tennis court oath. And there's a national assembly, and what they do is they basically the third estate calls themselves a national assembly, and they create an attack. A mob attacks the Bastille, which it does have a few political prisoners, but also is a place for them to very quickly basically get an armory and get a whole bunch of military weapons to help defend themselves. So it's an incredibly bloody battle that's won by that mob. And very quickly, this National Assembly decides to create the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. So again, it's not a declaration of independence because they're not far away from the colonial power. This is the colonial power trying to reinforce themselves. And so the big sticking point here isn't their independence. It is for equality of men and for them having representation. Unfortunately, the women are not included at this point, and several writers try to redress that in a couple of years, and unfortunately do not get too far. And the other idea in this is that the sovereignty resides in the people, and at this point, there's still arguments on whether they should have a king or not. Some of them want to keep a king, and so the huge things here is equality, sovereignty, and individual rights. Another way to put that is liberty, political freedom, equality, economic freedom, and fraternity, basically social freedom and working together. So the National Assembly abolishes the old social order. Similar to what Henry did earlier when he broke away from the Catholic Church, they immediately seized church lands and redefined clergy as civilians. Very quick way to get more money and land quickly. That their new constitution actually does retain a king, but he is really truly under subject authority of the legislative branch. They decide to have universal male suffrage. They create basically a conscription for war, so they have the military set ready to go. And how are they going to get rid of their enemies? Well, this is one of the birthplaces of the Enlightenment. So they try to create the most humane way to kill someone, and they settle on the guillotine, which, the long story short, is as far as they could tell, would be the quickest way for someone to be killed. And so one of the most famous, earliest and most famous victims of this will be the king as he makes a break for it. He and his wife, Marie Antoinette, are killed by guillotine in 1793. All right. So got rid of the king, new social order, but who's going to run it? Well, that's where we have Maximillian Robespierre really enters the picture. And Maximillian is this incredibly interesting figure in world history who really kind of starts as basically Abraham Lincoln and ends up dying as Hitler. So it's just incredible. One of the things that stays consistent is he is going to have a very, very strict moral code for himself. He is going to be considered the incorruptible. He will be the leader of what's the Committee of Public Safety, leader of a party called the Jacobin Party in this new National Assembly. And he is going to be one of the most skilled orators we have record of. He and his Jacobins are going to dominate the convention. They're going to dominate the National Assembly. And one of the things he is going to want to do is, again, one of the great power centers is the Catholic Church. So it wasn't enough in Robespierre's mind to have the churches closed. He's going to do several other things. So he's going to, the churches are closed, but he's going to force the priests to marry, which, from what I understand, then and now, Catholic priests are not allowed to marry. So you're basically turning them into a corrupt their vow against God. He is going to try to replace Catholicism and Christianity with something with deism, and his flavor of deism is going to be the cult of reason. And deism in general and his cult of reason is basically going to be, you don't worship a actual living God, you are worshiping reason itself. The idea of justice, the idea of wisdom, the idea of truth. Those are the things which you are promoting and trying to instigate. Another thing to try to kind of put a stumbling block in the church is proclaiming it year one, creating 10-day work weeks, 10-day weeks. So really hard to know where your Sabbath is and to figure all that stuff out. Another hallmark of Robespierre's leadership is just the sheer number of people who are going to be executed. So 40,000 people are going to be executed. 300,000 are going to be imprisoned. And as he has so much sway and power, this incorruptible leader is going to completely become corrupted. He is going to, over and over again, have these lists that he shows no one until the very last second, where he calls out these people, and those people are executed or they're imprisoned. And what ends up happening is that as his power is growing, he has more and more of these lists, and people are more and more paranoid. And we're having a crisis in media at this point, that people don't know who they can trust. And so Robespierre is the one who talks the best. And so in the midst of one of these arguments at the National Assembly, Robespierre says, "I have another list of enemies, and I have this list, but I'm not going to share it. I will share it tomorrow." He was hoping to do that to make his enemies calm down. What happened instead is he showed up, and they were tired of lists. They literally, he was such a good talker, and they were so angry at them. They literally cut, or I can't remember if it was cut or pulled out his tongue and jailed him, and he also went to the guillotine. So, who takes over after that? The people who take over that are the men of some of the men who are rich, and they form what's called the Directory. But they're having issues. They're unable to solve the really difficult economic and military problems that revolutionary France finds themselves in, and so they need someone else. They need another figurehead. They need someone else who's going to be strong militarily and is incredibly intelligent, and the people can help to rally behind. And so they decide to bring this guy, Napoleon, into the Directory. So he was of a noble family, but it was a minor one. He had quite a bit of success as an army officer, as I mentioned before, like Washington, able to brilliant strategist both beforehand and on the fly of battles, was a general by 24. And he does accept the Directory's offer to become a part of the Directory to help rule France. Looks at them unimpressed and decides to take it over himself. So he imposes his own constitution and names himself consul at first for life at 1802, because again, the French Revolution is very chaotic. Everything is being upended. So he's going to try to bring stability. And so he's got this French Empire here, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So how does Napoleon kind of stabilize things? Well, one of the things he does is he brings the church back. So what he does is he creates an agreement with the Pope called the Concordat, which is very important. So basically, he gets the blessing of the Pope. So what he does is he retains church lands. So France gets to keep the lands, but the clergy are on salary now. So the Catholic Church is able to gain some power, and people are able to gain some of the stability back that they did like. Also, he maintains the freedom of religion. So that helps to get the Protestants and Jews on his side as well, that they're able to practice their religion. He creates a centralized code called the Napoleonic Code in 1804, becomes a model of many other civil codes which came afterwards. One of the other things to kind of stabilize things again was to really reinforce the idea of patriarchal authority, of the husband being in charge of his family, and which will be upsetting to the women, but for the men, and as society had been before that, is something else that is welcomed by many of them. Now, the other thing, if you'll remember right, like I said, there was really a crisis of media going on. All sorts of people, Robespierre wasn't the only one making lists. A lot of people were making lists and stories and hearsay and rumors. And so what he does is he brings a tight control over newspapers to make sure, on one end, to make sure everything is right. On the other end, to make sure nothing against him is written that is bad. He's also going to have a secret police to kind of ferret out and make sure to cut people off before they become an issue for him within the government. Just so you know, this is not something that the United States is dealing with. In many ways, the United States is dealing with a media crisis of people going to different places for media, but there is no centralized government. There is no centralized government authority really controlling the media like what's happening here in revolutionary France. And just as a side note, because of the time we're living in, that is not what's happening either with what's happening with Trump losing all of his social media privileges. We still have an independent, free press in the United States. You just need to be sure of what you're saying and give proof and so on and so forth. Anyway, At the end of this here with Napoleonic France, Napoleon goes ahead and just kind of let's check this consul thing. He's just going to call himself emperor for life. So um, at this point, let me go back to the map to kind of show you this. So what happens is with France under a firm grasp, Napoleon starts taking over Europe. He knocks out. He really destabilizes the Kingdom of Spain completely. So that they're dependent on him. Same thing with the Confederation of the Rhine, Switzerland, so on and so forth. Portugal is at war with Napoleon, but he doesn't. Again, he doesn't try to really take them out because he's too busy moving to the east. England is a no-go for him, as is Sweden, but he has a nominal alliance with Austria and Russia and Norway and Denmark and Finland. What ends up happening is, though, that Napoleon decides that he needs to actually take the Russian Empire under his control. This is going to be his undoing because, as you can see, Russia is really far away from there. I literally have made this flight from, actually, not from Berlin, but from Bonn to Russia. It takes forever by plane to go to Moscow. That's very deep and far away from Europe. So what happens is his troops are unable to maintain his supply lines. They're frustrated, and eventually they have to go back. Winter sets in, making things even more difficult, and they get picked off as they're leaving back. Once he gets back to France, what ends up happening is that all of these countries which were at war with Napoleon basically forced him to abdicate, basically give up his power. So he's exiled to the Isle of Elba at first, then says, just kidding, escapes back, and then takes power again for 100 days. And then the British finally defeat him. He finally has his Waterloo at the Battle of Waterloo. He has his final defeat, really there by Britain. And at that point, he gets exiled to St. Helena, where he dies in 1821. Let me kind of show you to make this help you understand this. So at first, Napoleon is sent to Elba. As you can see, relatively quickly to get back. Once he loses in Waterloo, they're not playing anymore. They don't send him here. They send him all the way down here so that he cannot take power again. And with that, that is presentation number 2.